Morning everyone, thanks for coming along to this session on responsive design with Visualforce and Twitter Bootstrap. Thanks for coming here rather than going with everyone else to watch Hillary Clinton. Do appreciate it. So first up, we have the old friend, the safe harbor slide. I'm not entirely sure if I need this because I don't actually work for Salesforce. I'm part of the community, so if you feel like making any buying decisions based on anything that I say, then it's entirely up to you. Be interested to hear how that works out for you. So my name's Keir Bowden. I'm Chief Technical Officer of BrightGen. Is there anything we can do about the screen? So while they're trying to resolve that. Yes, I'm Keir Bowden. I'm Chief Technical Officer of BrightGen. We're a Platinum Cloud Alliance partner from the United Kingdom. I'm Salesforce certified everything, and I'm also a Force.com MVP. Have been for a few years now, which means I do a lot of this kind of thing in the community. If you frequent the community, you might know me better as Bob Buzzard. So what I'm going to talk about today is basically, what is responsive design, why you would want to use it, how you go about making pages responsive, a little overview, brief introduction to Bootstrap, which is my responsive design framework of choice, and finally I'm going to demo a responsive page and walk you through a couple of interesting items of the code. So first off, what is responsive design? So there's a great overview on Wikipedia, which hopefully you can read. And basically what that says is provide an optimal viewing experience, easy reading and navigation, and the key bit is with a minimum of resizing, panning and scrolling. So people shouldn't have to work hard to see your content regardless of what device they're accessing it on. So technically what this means is that the page responds to the device, to the capabilities of the device. So based on the viewport size, based on the orientation, it knows how much real estate it's got to work with, and the page can reorganize itself to push the important information to the front regardless of the device that you're on. The term was originally coined by Ethan Marcotte in an excellent article on a list apart. The short link there. Don't worry about capturing the short links because I'll be posting the slide deck up to SlideShare immediately afterwards, and I'll post out the link on the chatter feed for this session. But it's an interesting article. It's not too long, it's not too heavy, and there's some interesting information in there about how this was inspired by the concept of responsive architecture, because obviously you can't build multiple buildings for different people who are going to come to your offices or something like that. So what you have to try and do is make the one building respond in some way, shape or form to the people that are in. Sweet. Turned it off and turned it on again. I like that. Okay, so if that was too long and you weren't listening, basically what that means is that when I've got a page like this, and then I view that on a small screen, I don't have to do any of this scrolling around nonsense and trying to read things. Almost like if you can imagine trying to read a broadsheet newspaper on a train, you tend to fold it up and kind of read it round in a circle, which is not the easiest experience, so you don't really want to do that. Okay, so next up, why would you want to use responsive design? What's the benefit of it? Firstly, it gives you one site that you have to maintain, so you're not producing loads of different m.dot sites like we used to in the past, which is useful from the point of not repeating yourself, although content management systems can be pretty useful in maintaining the same content across a number of sites. If you're doing a major rebranding or something like that, it's likely you'll have to hit a number of template pages. It's also useful for visitor tracking, because you're not trying to figure out who the unique visitors are across a number of sites and trying to, if they came from the same IP address, we reckon that's the same person, trying to do all that kind of figuring out. And also, you'd need quite a lot of m.dot sites, so it's one of my favorite memes on the topic. If you're going to build an m.dot site, you're probably going to need about 40 of them, and that's only going to get worse as devices are now kind of getting bigger, you're getting into the phablet side of things. It's also Google's recommended approach for search engine optimization. Firstly, because it's easier for them to crawl, because they only need to supply a single user agent, and they don't have to pretend to be a phone, pretend to be a tablet, pretend to be different flavors of phone. And also, it's better for the link algorithm, because they know that all the links are going back to your content rather than going back to m.dot sites and then having to figure out those actually all dwindle down to be your single piece of content. And again, there's a short link there to the Google article, which goes into that in a bit more detail. So how do you go about making web pages responsive? So to my mind, there's three cornerstones for this. First cornerstone is the Viewport Meta Tag. So this is something that appears in the HTML header of the page, and it basically tells the device to behave in a particular way. So the first element of this is setting the width to the actual physical width of the device. So if you don't set that and you access a page in an iPhone, for example, that will report that it can display 980 pixel wide pages. And what you end up with is a massively zoomed out version of the page, which you have to pinch to zoom, scroll around a bit like I was doing when I showed you that first fixed page. Okay, the second item is setting the initial scale to 1.0, and that says display the page actual size. Don't display it zoomed out, don't display it zoomed in, display it as it actually is, let the user do what they wish with it. What you'll often see as well is advice to set the viewport user scalable feature to no. That's a really bad idea. You don't want to do that, basically because that's not really very good for accessibility. If you've got someone who's accessing your site that's partially sighted and they need to zoom in order to be able to read it, they're not going to be very happy that you fixed it. And they fixed the size and they can't zoom in or out, and they're unlikely to come back to your site because they can't access the content. The second cornerstone is the fluid grid. So what this does is this breaks up your page, your content, into a number of rows and columns that you can kind of almost deal with independently. 12 is probably the most popular number at the moment through most of the responsive frameworks, and that's because it divides up quite nicely. It divides by 2, it divides by 3, it divides by 4, it divides by 6. So in terms of breaking that up into smaller and smaller chunks for different devices, that's a very useful number. But most frameworks will allow you to effectively download a custom build where you can specify however many columns you actually want. So you can go to 7, you can go to 9, go to as many as you want. Excuse me. So where the fluid grids really come into their own is the reflow aspect. So this is the default behavior of Twitter Bootstrap. So if I build a page which is using the standard 12-column grid, and then I view that on a phone, what Bootstrap will do by default is reflow that into 1 column per row, and that will stretch everything out and make it a very deep page, which may not be what I want most of the time, because that tends to end up with quite a narrow amount of content going down a long way. But that's how it behaves by default, and then you've got some abilities to control that yourself. And the third cornerstone are CSS Media Queries. So essentially, this allows you to write an expression that limits the scope of the CSS. It allows you to write conditional CSS that will apply based on the device's capabilities. So if we take a very noddy, simple piece of CSS, this is saying that anything with the class of sidebar is not going to be displayed to the user. We downloaded, it'll consume bandwidth to get there, but then it will be hidden. And what we can then say is, here's a conditional piece of CSS, and what this means, that if the device has a minimum width of 1024 pixels or above, so anything that's got a relatively wide screen, in that case we'll display the sidebar because that's got enough real estate to allow it to appear. Anything smaller than that will hide the sidebar because that's just going to get in the way. One thing that's important to point out when you're using responsive design is that you don't want to remove content. If you're going to hide content, you want to find a way to allow users to access it. It may require an extra button click, it may require some scrolling. What you don't want to do is punish people for accessing your site on a mobile device. That's not the idea of it. It's still that information should be there regardless of which device you're hitting it with. Okay, next moving on to Bootstrap. As I say, this is my framework of choice. It's not just responsive design. It is a responsive front-end framework, but also it comes with a ton of CSS and JavaScript features that allow you to build quite nice-looking websites, in my opinion. It's not massively popular with purist web designers because what tends to happen is most Bootstrap sites look quite similar to each other. They've all got a black header bar, they're all using the same fonts, the same colors, the dialogue looks the same. But as I'm not a designer, I'm not from a design background, I'm not producing websites because to show off my elite graphic skills, I'm just more concerned about the content that's going on that site. So something like Bootstrap, which allows me to produce quite a nice looking site, I think, with a minimal effort, is absolutely perfect for me. It's mobile first. Now what that means is that when you define a style at the mobile level, so for an extra small device, that will cascade up. So if you display something on a large device or a desktop device, if you don't override it, that will pick up the same styling as the extra small. So that kind of reverse inheritance almost. Mobile first does not mean mobile ready. So you haven't got things like page transitions, you haven't got sidebar menus, you haven't got any of the things that you get from something like an Ionic framework or a jQuery mobile. They're talking about doing that in a later release, but there's nothing really there at the moment. And I've also found it's quite difficult to integrate some of the third-party offerings around that. It's also the #1 project on GitHub in terms of forks and stars, so it's clearly quite popular. So Bootstrap, by default, is a 12-column fluid grid that you can download a different version from the page. You can tweak the download that you're going to pull. It defines 4 breakpoints. So you've got large devices, medium, small, and extra small. As you can see, extra small is anything less than 768 pixels, which is quite a wide range of devices under that. And these default breakpoints you can use in the styling classes in terms of how many columns you want things to span. So if you define a div with a style of col-md-6, that says on medium devices, this div is going to span 6 columns of the grid. And then if I say col-xs12, what that means is on a extra small device, this is going to span the full width, the full 12 columns. And I can combine both of those. So I can say the same piece of content on a tablet takes up half, on a mobile device takes up the whole thing, depending on the real estate available. So where does Visualforce come into this? Not very much is the honest answer. Visualforce is effectively the container. It's allowing your pages to be served from somewhere because you've still got to host this somewhere, so why not in Visualforce on a force.com site if it's externally accessible. And it provides access to the data, so you still want to use the data bindings to get tight coupling with your force.com data. You'll definitely want to go for minimal page generation. You don't want header and body tags, so you certainly don't want the header tag because then you won't be able to get your viewport meta tag in there, which controls the behavior of the page. And you also want to exclude standard style sheets. A lot of the time you'll think you've got away with it and they don't conflict, and then there'll be kind of one thing when using one of the esoteric features of Twitter Bootstrap, and suddenly you'll get something jump out about 5 times the size of everything else. When you're combining Visualforce and Bootstrap, you want to avoid most of the standard components that actually render HTML, render a particularly styled version of HTML. So things like page block sections, page block tables, you don't want to use those because they're not responsive. What happens is as the device shrinks, they'll narrow to a certain point, and then they'll just cut it off, and the user will have to scroll around. So I tend to find what I'm mainly using is include script and Apex style sheet to bring in the external resources, to bring in JavaScript, to bring in CSS, all the various Bootstrap components. I use output text because that's really nice for formatting currencies and for formatting dates. And I use Apex repeat because I'm normally iterating across a bunch of components. And something else that's worth thinking about, especially if you're going to be accessing your responsive pages on a mobile device, is whether you should be using forms or whether you should be using Visualforce remoting. So remoting's fast, it's lightweight, it's stateless. You're not sending the huge view state back to the server. However, what you have got to do yourself is the DOM manipulation. So you'll probably end up writing a reasonable amount of boilerplate HTML to push the results into certain areas of the page. Okay, so now on to the demo. So the demo is, as I gave you a quick peek at the beginning, there's a blog landing page. It's got some recent posts in it. Users have the ability to add comments to those posts. They can search the posts that are in there, and also there's some links to social media, to my Facebook and Twitter profiles. So there's a QR code there if you want to access it on a mobile device. There's the short link there, and the code is available on GitHub at that repository shown. Okay, so if I jump out, so this is my fixed version. I'll just do a quick recap of that. So to access this, it's not the greatest user experience in the world. All the images are quite large. It's quite difficult to get at most of the content. So if I then switch to a responsive version of this page, so the first instance, because we're on 1024 pixels, it's a large device. So we're basically looking exactly the same as we were. Key things to keep an eye on are the BrightGen logo in the header, the image of the little spaceman, the sidebar components, so the search, the about me, and also, although we can't really see it great, the comments section, which at the moment are shown inline. So all the content is there on a single page, in a single place, once I access this from a desktop. If I then resize this to 992 pixels, so not a huge amount changes, but if I just do that again, keep your eye on the spaceman, so suddenly that's a different picture. The text has gone off, it's narrowed down because we've got a bit less real estate. And the picture, that's just a little bit of fun to add a little bit of color to it. But the most important thing is actually the text of the blog post. So we shrink the picture down to get more of the post involved. If I then drop this down to 768, which is 768 pixels is small in the words of Twitter Bootstrap. So we'll see a few more changes this time. So I'll do this a couple of times again, probably. So as you can see, it has changed a fair bit. So keep an eye on the sidebar is probably the main thing. As we go down to 768, the sidebar's disappeared. So the Twitter and Facebook links, I've now got buttons in the header that I can click on, and that opens those in a new window. So I haven't taken that content away, but I don't figure the Twitter and the Twitter and Facebook side of things is what people have come to my blog page to see. So I get that out of the way when we've got less real estate. Also, the search and about components that were in the sidebar, they're still there. They've just been stacked down the bottom of the page because it's really not much help to people to see about me and necessarily to be able to search. Again, I want to get the blog post in there front and center. And also notice that the comments, now we've got a bit less real estate, the comments are hidden initially, and then they can be toggled, and you can bring those to the fore if you so desire. And finally, drop down to 320 pixels. So again, keep an eye on the BrightGen logo, keep an eye on the image. So the image has then changed, it's become a much smaller one. And the BrightGen logo has gone from being the full BrightGen logo with the name just to our icon. And also notice that the menu has changed. That's no longer got a set of links. That's now a hamburger button. And if you click on that, you get to see the menu items appear there. My help and about, my search and about, it's all still accessible. None of the information has gone anywhere. We haven't punished anyone. We've tried to get the important information front and center of their device, and then those that are interested in the kind of more edge pieces of information, they've still got a way of accessing those. So, if I jump back to my PowerPoint. Okay, so a couple of interesting pieces of code. So firstly here, we have the markup that's going to lay out what the post and what the sidebar look like. So if you look at the classes on the post content there, if for an extra small device, then I've set that to be 12 columns because I want to span the whole device because we haven't really got enough room to try and squash a sidebar in. And the sidebar content, again, spans 12, and what that means is those stack underneath each other. However, if we're on a medium device and upwards, so medium and large, remembering the kind of mobile-first reverse inheritance, if we're on a medium device, then we'll take up 9 columns, and we'll have 3 columns available for the sidebar. So what that means is on in a very small device, you have all the posts and then search and about, as we saw in the demo, stack underneath. But if we've got a lot more real estate, we can have the posts and we can move the search and about. So there's no JavaScript involved, nothing like that. It's all CSS, and the browser just takes the decision to reflow things based on the capabilities of the device. So next up, this is the comments toggling button, or whether we display the comments toggling or whether we display the comments actually in the page. So the first div is hidden for medium and hidden for large. So that'll only be displayed on extra small and small devices, which will give them the toggle comments button. And the second div, which is hidden for extra small and hidden for small, means it will be displayed on medium and large devices, and that will show the full comments. So notice that you don't get any kind of inheritance when you're using the hidden tags. You have to explicitly specify which size that's going to be hidden in. And what that means, when I hit it on the large screen, the bottom div will apply, and we'll see the comments in all their glory. When I hit it on a smaller screen, we get that small button. And the final piece of code I wanted to look at was the code that's generating the menu. So this is using standard Bootstrap. I haven't had to do anything in here to tell it how to behave in particular classes of device. So the first div with the class of navbar header, that's the item that generates the hamburger menu. And that will appear, the hamburger menu button, and that will appear on an extra small device. And there's nothing, well, there probably are things I can do to change that in terms of styling, but Bootstrap gives me that for free. And I just put as many spans in as I want kind of stacks on the hamburger. So when you're an extra small, that's what will appear. The next section, the div with the style classes of collapse and navbar collapse, that will actually generate the links. So at the moment, I've only shown one of the links, the search button, but there's obviously a number of those in there. And what happens when that is displayed, which is on small, medium, or large, is you get to see the full menu. And notice also, in the search link, I've got that in there for extra small and small, but once we get into medium and large, I don't need to display the search because that's already in the sidebar component. So the menu on a large device will just have, the large and medium device will just have the links. Okay, so the last thing I want to talk about is images. So this is still a bit of a challenge in terms of responsive design. because desktop images can be quite large, they can be quite heavyweight, and that uses up a lot of bandwidth and memory. So if you're on a small footprint device, that can be quite heavy for it. So there was a study done in 2012 that found that 86% of sites deliver the same content regardless of the device. Just throw everything at it and let the browser sort it all out. Great use of bandwidth. So there's a number of solutions that have been used and have been proposed. The first one, which I think is the worst one, is download and hide. And that means you send all your images, even if it's a phone, you send them the desktop, you send them the tablet, you send them a little image, throw them all down there, and then let the device figure out which one it's going to display. So you've got all the overhead of maintaining all those images, and none of the benefit of selectively sending them to the device. Okay, then you've got download and shrink. So this, I think, is the reason why in 2012, 86% of sites delivered the same content to each device. The idea is you just send a massive image down and you let the browser figure out how to shrink it down using 100% div widths and things like that. It's pretty wasteful because if you reduce the height and width of an image by 50%, that means you've thrown away 75% of the information that was sent to you. It's also not very good for art direction. So if you think of an image which is a big tree and a happy family in the corner picnicking under it, if you shrink that down to go on a mobile device, all you can really see is the tree, and there's a little blob where the happy family are. And if the intention of this is to show people enjoying outdoor living, you've lost that completely. You've just got a big picture of a tree. So you probably don't want to do that. You probably want to send appropriate pictures to the device. So the future solution for this, which will be the right solution, is the HTML5 picture element. So the idea of this is you'll maintain multiple images on the server appropriate for different form factors, and the client will decide the best image to load for the device. And it will do this through CSS. It will be handled by the browser. You won't have to write any code. You'll just use appropriate markup. And that's what it's going to look like. Hopefully you can read that. So there'll be a picture tag, then you'll have source attributes, each of which has, if you remember from the beginning, media queries in there. So the first source item there has media of a minimum width of 1024 pixels. So that will send down the large image if you're on a large device. If the minimum width is 768 to 1024, send the medium image. Otherwise, have the small image sent, which is all great. However, some devices, even when the HTML5 picture element comes along, some devices aren't going to support that straight out of the box. There's going to be older devices. So the idea is that you then embed a fallback image, so just a regular image tag. The downside to that is the way browsers will work a lot of the time in terms of trying to be efficient, trying to preload images, they will wander the HTML while it's being rendered, find any images and preload them. So at that point in time, you've preloaded an image, and if they support the picture element, you don't want that. So you just wasted bandwidth pulling it down and throwing it away. So that's something that's still currently being solved. Downside to the picture element, if you go on Can I Use, you have to turn on experimental stuff, you have to configure preferences. So that's not going to get a huge amount of adoption at the moment. You know, none of my customers, none of my enterprise customers are going to be interested in running experimental versions of Chrome and Opera. However, Chrome and Firefox are intending to support this, in quote marks, by the end of the year, whatever that means. But this is one that does seem to be getting quite rapid adoption. It's made its way into the experimental and into the preferences relatively quickly. So I think there's a lot of groundswell behind this. So the solution that I use at the moment is Picture Fill by Scott Gel. So Picture Fill is a polyfill for the HTML5 picture element. And what a polyfill means is it's a JavaScript solution that's adding some functionality that older devices don't have or that hasn't made its way into the full standard yet. Works in a very similar way. You have multiple images on the server. The client loads the best image for the device. The downside to it is it uses JavaScript, so you get some latency. Page displays, then it goes and gets the picture. That's what I'm using in my demo, so you can see it wasn't particularly slow. And obviously, it gets better if you've hit those pages before and those images are cached. But you can the first time, especially on a desktop, you might see a little bit of latency. So the way this works is instead of using the picture element, it's all done off span elements with data attributes, HTML5 data attributes. For those not familiar with HTML5 data attributes, they're custom attributes. They do whatever you want. The browser just ignores them. So data-picture means something to your code, doesn't mean anything to the browser. It's got the data- prefix. Therefore, it's yours, and it will leave it to you. So this is the code from the blog page. As you can see, 3 spans, data source, And then data media is the media query. Looks very similar to the main picture element. Doesn't have the concept of a fallback image because they're only spans. What it'll do is it will just default to the small image because there's nothing else around that. So this works with spans or divs. What I've found is that if you use divs, that doesn't really play nicely with Bootstrap formatting. Bootstrap thinks that divs do other things. So I always tend to fall back to the span otherwise, especially if you're using them in headings. If you're using them in the header bar, then often that will suddenly go double width and things will jump down to the next line, which isn't ideal. Okay, and there's a link there. That's a short link to the GitHub repository, which has a README about picture fill and more information. Okay, so that's what I wanted to say on responsive design. One more point on the demo page. If you access that, on the top menu, we have a link section. That takes you to another page, which is responsive. That'll reflow itself and lay out. But those are all the resources that I use to learn responsive design in the first place. So those are all the ones, or these are all the useful resources, I should say. I read lots of other things that weren't great, but these are the ones that actually gave me a lot of information. And I don't come from a web design background. I'm originally a Java programmer. I've done a lot with Visualforce, but I'm by no means a web designer. And I found these were really useful resources. Okay, so that's me. Does anybody have any questions?
In your example with the blog post, was there a way that you could only show like the first paragraph of text in certain conditions, or it's always going to be the whole blog post?
You could do that. It depends on exactly how you're capturing that text. If that's one of the tricky bits around doing that kind of thing is if you're using a rich text area and you're allowing people to put HTML formatting in, if you try and just chunk out the first 100 characters or something like that, you can find yourself in the middle of an open tag that bleeds out into the rest of the page. So when I do that, I tend to have a separate field which contains the summary information, and then I'll conditionally render that in based on the size of the device. However, because it's using CSS queries to conditionally render, well, that means you're just sending everything to device, and then you just pick which one to show. So if you've got very large very large body contents, you can end up pushing a lot of bandwidth. Okay, cool. It's a long way from the mic.
What about for more complex sort of drop-down menus? So a lot of times in your header, you'll have some menus, and then they'll have items underneath and maybe sub-items.
Yeah, Bootstrap's got very good support for that. It's got very good support for kind of select menus, for kind of sub-menus, all of that kind of stuff. It actually works really well.
Does it work well on a small device? I mean,
sorry?
For the extra small devices?
For the extra small devices, you just have it again as a hamburger menu, and that would just kind of break out. So what tends to happen is you suddenly lose the content. You'll end up with a page full of menu. Although there are some additional plugins where once you click on the hamburger menu, that'll actually have the full menu down at the bottom of the page. That'll zoom you down to it, and you can select rather than pushing everything out of the way. Okay. The Bootstrap is pretty good at that. Anybody else? Nobody else? If anyone wants to ask any questions, you don't want to do it over the microphone, then feel free to come and see me afterwards, and I'll feel free to grab me in the corridor or when I'm around in the dev zone for the rest of the day. Thank you very much, everyone. Thanks for coming along.